quite interesting discourse at Munich Security Conference. We're here for some instant reaction. I'm Jack Detsch. I'm a defense reporter here at POLITICO. I have Ambassador Michael McFaul, the former U.S. ambassador to Russia.
Thanks for having me. I'm not sure they thank you that we're talking, but
well, yeah.
It seems like they're doing okay without us, but I'm happy to be with you.
Yeah, no, just curious to casually chat about what we just saw. The Munich keynote, always kind of something that echoes in history a bit, but not the speech we were expecting. Certainly a discourse from the Vice President about free speech, about what's going on in Europe. Very little mention, if any mention, of Ukraine, NATO, some of the big topics and confusion that's on the mind of European politicians here.
Yeah, well, I'll have to read the speech and think about it. My initial reaction was three different things. So number one, as an American, and I want to be clear, as an American citizen, listening to my elected official, and he won in a free and fair process, but for him to come to Europe and say the biggest threat to Europe is your lack of democracy, is your censorship, I just think is analytically incorrect. The greatest threat to Europe is Russia. I was just with some Ukrainian soldiers literally before his speech, an hour before his speech. They, by the way, consider themselves European. That's their identity. Censorship and those kinds of threats are not the things that they think are the biggest threats. So I just think analytically, some of the things are legitimate. I think talking about what happened in Romania is legitimate. But to say that that is the biggest threat to Europe at this moment, when everybody else at this meeting thinks we're in a major crisis in terms of the transatlantic relationship, was wrong. Number two, the irony of the elected officials from the United States of America coming here and talking about individual problems of democracy when President Trump called the last election illegitimate. He said it was not a fair election. He then inspired people to storm our parliament, our Capitol building. And then when he was elected president, he let all those people out of jail. I'm sorry, but there's a hypocrisy to be lecturing Europeans about how well they are practicing democracy when we are struggling with the practice of democracy at home. And the last thing I'll say in terms of immediate reactions, these guys are all about sovereignty when we're talking about America. Sovereignty, America first, right? We get to govern the way we want to govern. And yet, to come here and to lecture an entire continent, he didn't even talk about individual countries. He lectured an entire continent about their flaws. I just would point out there's some real hypocrisy about our sovereignty we're going to defend, but your sovereignty, it's free for us to tell you what to do, and it's free for us to have the richest Americans be very directly involved in your elections. As he joked about it, but it's that's not actually a defense of sovereignty. That's something else.
Yeah.
Other than that, I love the speech.
As a footnote, of course, JD Vance did not accept the results of the 2020 election.
Yes, he did not.
And I'm just curious sort of where this, how you see the administration sort of coming into this moment and making this type of speech. Was this misreading the room? Was this misreading the audience? What confusion does this leave in the minds of Europeans after not addressing some of the key issues here? Ukraine, NATO did not really make any noise in this speech.
Well, just one more comment thinking about the speech, the fourth thing, it's related to that. There was a hypothesis in the speech that the voices of Europeans and democracies are not allowed to speak and are not being represented. I'm not an expert on elections in all of European countries, but I know a little bit about it, and I don't think that hypothesis is not shared by data. The people that have his views in Europe are represented in all kinds of parliaments all across the continent. They're competing in elections in this country in 9 days. So this notion that there's censorship, that he used the word commissars to describe the European Union. I know a little bit about real commissars. I studied the Soviet Union. That is just insulting, and it's just empirically not true. But then he left out the places where it is true. You know, Russia, you know, if you're worried about censorship, if you're worried about jailing your opposition, if you're worried about killing the leaders of the opposition, that's what happened here a year ago in Munich when Alexei Navalny was killed. The fact that he would focus just on the crisis in Europe on these things and not speak about Russia, I thought was a big missed opportunity. But to your point, he obviously made a decision that he was going to give a political speech about, you know, the values that he aspires to, and, you know, that's okay. But I think the audience, and most certainly I, was waiting for clarification about what right now is a very convoluted set of statements that the Trump administration has made about their involvement in a peace process with respect to Ukraine and their negotiations with Putin. This would have been a fantastic opportunity to clarify that. He himself has made contradictory statements compared to the Secretary of Defense. This speech could have been a moment of clarification, and he chose not to do that. He chose to do a different speech.
Right. We saw Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, of course, at the Ukraine Defense Contact Group earlier this week, make some statements about how Ukraine would end up at the end of the war not whole, and then, of course, walked those comments back later. It seems like this is creating a lot of confusion among the Europeans. I mean, what message do you think people may be taking away from, of course, the convoluted messaging earlier in the week from the administration, and now this speech, which, of course, doesn't seem to be on some of the major topics that are for debate here?
Well, one takeaway I had is that our vice president's not going to be involved in foreign policy, right? So when I was in the government, the 2009 speech was delivered by a Vice President Biden, and when he came to this conference, it was very clear that he was going to be a major player in foreign policy. Whether that was good outcomes or bad outcomes, that's for others to judge. But that was a very clear signal. His speech was about security. This speech was not, which suggests to me that the vice president's going to be involved in these issues back home and not involved in foreign policy. The second thing, the takeaway is they are not going to be afraid to take, you know, Trumpism abroad. That was, you know, he has his definition of values that are not neutral. They're very partisan from my point of view, and he's decided they've decided that this is going to be part of their foreign policy. That is something very new.
And where does this leave the Europeans, of course? Because they had a lot of questions, of course, about the peace deal. They had a lot of questions about what would come after the peace deal. Would it be peacekeepers on the ground? Would it be some sort of armed force? They had questions about the 5% mark that we didn't hear any answers to. Does this send the message to the Europeans that potentially they have to lead on these issues and maybe factor the United States out of the equation?
Yes. I mean, my hope is that that will not be the case. And I, as an American, I hope I won't be censored by these folks, right? I hope I'll have the chance to articulate a different perspective in a democratic society, in a democratic country. My hope is that we will have a debate about these issues because most Americans don't want to pull out of NATO, by the way. The polling on that's very clear. Most Americans actually support assistance to Ukraine. Polling's very clear on that. The last vote we had on it, it was crystal clear. Majorities in both houses voted for that. So we should have that debate, and I hope there's not a premature conclusion that we're leaving. But they're sending the signals that they want to leave. They want Europe to be in the lead. And so if Europe is supposed to be in the lead, then one, Europe has to be part of the negotiations. And I think it was just a tactical mistake that President Trump called Putin before he called anyone in Brussels, before he called anyone in any of the major countries in Europe, and before he called Zelensky. Because ultimately, if they're supposed to be in charge of their own security, they have to be part of the negotiation. And I hope that message is clear. And I welcome that. I think that would be great. We want Europe. The European speakers that spoke today also said the same thing. I think this is a turning point where, from my point of view, somebody also believes in democratic values. We need a stronger Europe, and I hope that is a result of this conference.
In the last 40 seconds I have with you, obviously this was going to be an agenda setter. Where does Vance's speech leave the agenda for the rest of the conference?
My guess is most people at this conference won't have much to say about that speech. That speech was orthogonal. That was off to the side. That was a speech, I think, intended in many ways for American domestic audiences more than this audience. Maybe I'll be surprised by that, but my guess is we'll be waiting to hear about what I consider to be the much more immediate threats to security. He somehow thinks it's censorship. I actually think it's Russia, and my guess is most people here still think it's Russia.
Wonderful. Well, Ambassador McFaul, thank you so much for coming up on stage with me. And
Thank
everyone,
you.
stick around. We have a great program coming up in just a few minutes. We'll have a meet and greet with Ukrainian fighters and then a congressional roundtable. So stay tuned. Thank you.